Welcome to the Chaos Sector. We step away from our daily reporting to focus on the entertainment world. Let's discuss the latest Halloween retcon series. For those who do not know what a retcon is, well, it's just a remake of an original work, such as films produced. Halloween has become the most criticized series due to how an altered storyline affects the main characters. Retcon, or retroactive production, does not work well in this series. Why? Let's get started. We start with the first installment to the retcon series, Halloween, released in 2018. Before we get started, Halloween H2O, although being a retcon film, was obviously erased in the storyline. Also Halloween Resurrection. So what were those films then? That's what we will break down. The plot. It's been 40 years since Laurie Strode survived a vicious attack from crazed killer Michael Myers on Halloween night. Locked up in an institution, Myers manages to escape when his bus transfer goes horribly wrong. Laurie now faces a terrifying showdown when the masked madman returns to Haddonfield, but this time, she's ready for him. That is the official plot of the film, but we have a major problem. 40 years later? In the film's setting, Myers is locked away in an institution, and he has been there for 40 years? How can you capture the quote, pure evil and destruction of Myers, if he's locked away for 40 years? It doesn't work, as that iconic killer would have escaped 2 months into being locked up, especially since he's driven to kill. And that's another issue with this film, motive. If Myers is locked away for 40 years, then he doesn't have a motive. Surely if Myers was driven to kill, that urgency from evil would manifest within a few weeks, let alone a year, and most definitely not after 40 years. But, that's what the producers wanted, so let's break it all down. The opening scenes focus on 2 so-called investigative journalists doing a story and podcast on Michael Myers and his murders 40 years ago. He is about 60 years old, surrounded by mental patients, blabbering nonsense. They are depicted as podcasters more so we will call them such. The concept of a pair of podcasters intrigued about a serial killer, after 40 years, does not make sense whatsoever. Their interests would make sense if that serial killer had, killed recently, right? Or if he had murdered dozens of people over those years. But their so-called intrigue has no logical basis. It creates an undeserved focus on these podcasters who serve no real purpose, because there is no relative motive to their interest, because nothing has happened recently in the storyline. Within 40 years, these podcasters surely would have some other serial killer somewhere to focus on, right? The scene basically ends with one of the podcasters yelling at Myers, provoking him with his mask. That somehow, he obtained by the Attorney General? Not sure what credentials an investigative journalist has, but for him to obtain a mask of a serial killer, wow. Might as well hand over Myers' classified files to them while you're at it. All to present an exaggerated opening scene into the movie. Instead of random so-called investigative journalists, how about one of them being a relative of a Myers victim 40 years ago? This works in distracting the audience from the very fact that it's been 40 years. This way, when they encounter Myers, their deaths have an emotional link to Myers, yet he doesn't know it. That creates intrigue, it helps the audience quote, warm back up to a senior citizen serial killer. Despite this display of emotion, their deaths are nothing more than fluffy film runtime. Which could have been used to establish that potential plot. Would make their deaths more suspenseful. If they don't provide context to why Myers escapes after a 40-year hiatus, then the audience is just as lost and stagnant as Myers in the film. But the next important scene is at Laurie Strode's home. The podcasters want to ask her questions regarding Myers. Laurie is hesitant to open her security gate until there is an offer of $3,000? Okay, so she has restricted access from her property, which is obviously to protect herself, but $3,000 simply threw that all out the window apparently. Laurie opens the gate, allowing these complete strangers into her property. I guess you can't say no to the greenbacks, regardless of potential danger. They enter her home and want to interview her about the experience. They do mention Myers' backstory, which is at least relevant to the original film. But there's a problem, the dialogue. The conversation had between Laurie and the investigators is so bland, so indirect, so uninformative, it doesn't provide anything to the audience. Laurie asks the male, do you believe in the boogeyman? And he replies, I believe in Michael Myers, but not the boogeyman. And Laurie replies, you should. The male is either being condescending, or he literally is suggesting that Laurie is crazy for believing in the boogeyman, who children called Michael Myers. This gray area of what he meant was so unnecessary. Just have the male say, well, that's what you called him? And Laurie replies, yes, when we were younger. And that dialogue continues briefly, to establish Myers into the scene with a subtle intensity, rather than a boring conversation in the early moments of the film. But, you may think I'm being too picky, fine, whatever. The film introduces Laurie's family, her daughter Karen, and her granddaughter, Allison. Although it's just a traditional scene, let's provide a bit of context. Karen was sheltered and protected as a child, and even trained for the potential arrival of Myers in Haddonfield. She was taken away from Laurie, and this is how her life turned out. Typical family setting, where Allison is somewhat the key focus, mainly because she's young. It's indicated in how the camera focuses more on Allison, and have Karen and her husband blurred in the background. So it appears Allison will be a key character. In the end of this scene, Allison asked Karen if she invited her grandmother Laurie to dinner, and Karen claims she did invite her, but that her grandmother was not coming. But Allison's response indicated she knew her mother was lying. And as Allison leaves for school, Karen says she loves her. But Allison didn't say it back. To some credit, this gives the film a bit of layered emotional baggage, which may work in other films, but how does this apply to Halloween? Let's find out. Zarin, you're the Halloween fanatic, I'll let you finish the review.
Halloween is one of my favorite horror films, yet it was single-handedly ruined by one person, I'll explain later. But the next key scene in this film is the reference to Laurie and Myers being siblings. Allison, the granddaughter of Laurie, is walking with her friends. The male character asks, wasn't it her brother who killed all those teenagers? And Allison says, no, that's just some rumor to make people feel better. Now, why is this male character asking this question if there is no context given? There is no reference or even hint at Laurie and Myers being related. And also, how did he obtain this information? Who told him this? Where is it coming from, without the storyline of them actually being related? Of course, shifting between both related and non-related storylines only complicates the actual storyline because the audience is anticipating this to be revealed somewhere within the film. Also, Allison's explanation is just as irrational as the male's sibling reference. To make them feel better? How does spreading a rumor that Laurie and Myers are related make the townfolk feel better? Laurie has done nothing wrong, she is not responsible for what Myers did. But then again, although it sounds like empty dialogue, it serves a purpose. That purpose is to make the audience assume Allison is trying to deny that rumor of Laurie and Myers being siblings. It is done in a subtle manner, but because the storyline does not implement this relation, overall it's just gibberish. To me at least. And then there was the classic classroom scene, only this time, it's Allison staring out the window, at her grandmother Laurie. I understand the element of nostalgia, but this scene comes off as desperation. It tries to show a protective nature of Laurie, following her granddaughter around, essentially stalking her. But it creates a setting of Myers targeting Allison when he knows nothing about her, doesn't even know about Karen, and more than likely has forgotten about Laurie as well. So the threat presented to Allison in this scene is more about alluding to that threat, because there is no motive to kill Allison specifically. And these little subliminal jabs are what piss me off about the retcons. Basically, this scene is Laurie Strode concerned about her granddaughter because Myers, her great-uncle, is coming to kill her. That is the subliminal plot presented, without actually making it the storyline. It would have been a far better film if they just went with that. But of course, this compromises the entire development of Halloween going forward. So you have these nostalgic reference points that are just that. And due to this, the character in Laurie Strode appears consumed with reliving her past than any real threat of the past in the present. In the next scene, there is a great moment between Laurie and Allison, I will give that some credit. It shows Allison reaching out to her grandmother to be in her life. Displaying the importance of family to the audience is always a good route to take. This scene would have had a greater impact if that family connection included Michael Myers. A young Allison doesn't grasp the danger she is in, and the grandmother knows Myers is coming for them all. And as the film progresses, Allison finally realizes the danger she is in. It happens anyway, but it's more of a coincidental danger rather than relativity. Different impact, different character role. The next key scene is in fact that dinner. Basically, Laurie arrives to dinner, grabs a glass of wine, and breaks down. She leaves the dinner as Allison decides to follow her. Another great scene of Laurie and Allison, and it does provide a real impact of Laurie's personal struggles after her encounter. But the negative vibe of Karen shrouds that connection. Karen explains to her daughter what her childhood was like, which explains her cold disposition to her mother. But it doesn't fit the mood, perhaps because Karen does not show any real emotional effects herself. She doesn't break down crying, it appears more dismissive, and ironically despite her backstory, Allison's heart gravitates towards her grandmother more than Karen her mother. The directors should have had Karen break down crying in this scene, which would show how her childhood was destroyed by Myers indirectly. But without that emotional moment, to me, it's just empty dialogue. The next key scene is the dysfunctional relationship with Laurie and Karen. Lori breaks into Karen's home, spooks her and her husband, and goes on to ramble about Myers escaping. The narrative here is that Karen does not concern herself with Michael Myers, even though he tried to kill her mother. Understandable after 40 years, so it makes Lori appear mentally ill, basically a schizophrenic. But it's the ending of this scene which makes no sense. Laurie Strode is preparing for Michael's arrival. This is a big deal, right? She pleads with Karen and her husband, and after a few exchanges, Karen pushes her out of the house, and Lori simply gives up. If she enters the home with so much urgency, attempting to get Karen to grab Allison and leave the town, where did that urgency go? She didn't even attempt to resist being pushed out of the house. It's like, "You're crazy mother, I won't let you ruin my happy home." And Lori's like, "Oh well, that's how you feel, I'll call you tomorrow, love you." Instead of this lackluster incident, have Karen at least sit down and talk to her mother at this point, including Karen's husband. You can still present doubt in Karen's mind, but also display optimism. This way, her lack of urgency does carry an element of concern. With these adjustments, the intensity gradually builds, not just from Laurie Strode, but from Karen and Allison. We come to the tail end of the film, which is supposed to have the greatest suspense, the greatest intensity, the classic battle between Myers and Laurie Strode, a great ending. But, it literally falls apart, and makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Allison and Oscar are walking down the street, then they have the typical teenage moment. After rejecting Oscar's advance, Allison walks off, and Oscar gets killed by Myers. Allison comes back after hearing Oscar scream, which she thought was a joke prior. Only to find out Oscar was killed, and Myers comes from behind the corner. This is when Allison realizes that Myers is most definitely alive. She runs down the street and is eventually found by Officer Hawkins. What's so bad with this setting, you ask? It's the next scene that follows, which is the problem in connection to that previous chain of events. In between scenes, Laurie arrives at Karen's house and asks where Allison is. This is the focus of this scene, the safety of Allison. Okay, let's stay on that path. When Laurie, Karen, and her husband go into her home, they all enter into Laurie's secret basement. The problem here is that they are missing someone, right? Allison. This secret basement is Laurie's defense against Myers. She set her home up to be an inescapable entrapment for Myers. When Karen and her husband head down, Laurie stands there, indicating she is heading out to find Allison. But instead, she heads downstairs with them? The earlier scene of Laurie standing outside of Allison's classroom is even more obsolete. It was presented as if Laurie had basically given up on Karen, but was more concerned about her granddaughter's safety. Yet, when the most important point of the film is unfolding, there is no instinctive drive for Laurie to head out to find Allison. Laurie does not know that Allison has been found by Officer Hawkins, so with Myers lurking in the neighborhood, wouldn't Laurie fear for Allison's safety? But she would rather save her daughter and Karen, who has her own protection in her husband, while Allison is out there all alone? And, Karen has been prepared for this moment, so she could handle herself when the time comes, right? After all, it was this military-based training that essentially ruined their relationship. So you have both highly trained mother and daughter together in the basement, while Allison is literally a sitting duck for Myers out in the streets? And we're not letting Allison's father off the hook neither, that is his daughter out there. He didn't show any concern for Allison, just follow orders from Laurie, yes ma'am. Don't think that the officers contacted Karen or Laurie about finding Allison, as to why there was no urgency. This was never established, and even if it was, instincts to physically find Allison would take over. Let's focus on this a bit more. Karen is talking to the officers, concerned that Allison is not picking up her phone. So what they are alluding to is Laurie has come to the conclusion that Allison is already dead. This is never stated by Laurie, because it would obviously raise doubt in Karen's mind. Now the narrative of the storyline is the Sarah Connor effect. Of course, but to establish this, the directors contradicted the very element of Laurie's preparation. She should have headed out into town, with her weaponry, and demand Karen and husband stay back at the house. This gives Laurie the stronger role in the film, because she is literally attempting to save her granddaughter. A fight scene unfolds, and the finale ends up at the house just like it would anyway. And then there is the lack of urgency from Karen herself. She doesn't decide to go out and find her daughter. It simply destroys the entire film, because if both Laurie and Karen would have headed out to find Allison, it revives the element of Laurie as the protective mother, and provides Karen with a similar role with her daughter. Wow, it's not realistic, no matter how they try to allude to Allison being killed already. Even with this assumption, Laurie and Karen should show more hope for Allison, right? And this type of screenwriting is why the movie fails horribly. But let's conclude. The infamous Dr. Sartain kill scene is flat out wacky as hell. Although it provides a cool twist, in context of the film, it's just more fluffy runtime of the movie. They approach Myers on the road, Hawkins runs him over, and in a plot twist, Sartain stabs Officer Hawkins. Now for some reason, the directors thought it was a good idea to have Allison locked in the back seat. I guess it's to prevent her from escaping, and honestly, forcing her to be in the crappy scene. But Sartain then grabs Myers' mask and stands up in front of Allison, merely for once again, fluffy runtime in the film. Myers being hit by a car seemed to be on the ground entirely too long. This is to justify the fluffy runtime. He opens the door and places Myers in the back seat with Allison. Yeah, I know, it means Allison wasn't actually locked in. Directors think, if we have Allison grabbing at one side and it's locked, the audience would assume both doors are locked. Then Sartain doesn't pull out any keys to confirm this assumption. No, he just opens the back door and places Myers in the back seat. Directors do make mistakes, but it's genuine. This is clearly stating, who cares if the other door is unlocked, the audience is more concerned about Myers in this scene. But interesting enough, Dr. Sartain tells Allison that people were trying to kill Myers, which he would not allow, because he wanted to understand the evil inside him? So, after 40 years of having him in your facility, you couldn't figure that out? You know what, that's enough, let's end it here. Well, I can't. This is retarded as hell, but I have to finish it up. There's a fight scene we need to break down. Okay, there are a lot of oddities in the final scenes. To no surprise, Myers kills Sartain. Not gonna waste time with the details of it, rather focus on the key element of that moment. Myers doesn't kill Allison in the back seat, he allows her to live. I will explain why in a moment, because everyone wondered about this particular scene. Allison jumps out the back seat after Myers drags Sartain's body onto the road. She then runs into the woods, as Myers watches. He then kills other officers in the distance, and uses their cruiser to arrive, guess where? At Laurie's home. But Myers has left another survivor out there, something he doesn't do. Some assume that Myers knew she was headed nowhere in the woods, but it's still a vulnerable human to kill. Although Myers arrives at Laurie's home, with Laurie, Karen and husband preparing, the real focus should be on Allison in the woods. This naturally is the plot's direction, yet they decided to go away from that? Well, scene building was the problem. They had to allow Myers to spare Allison so he can kill the officers to get their cruiser and arrive at Laurie's home later. This changes the runtime of this specific scene. The directors were so focused on the showdown between Myers and Laurie. The directors have Allison running through the woods, looking back as if Myers is chasing her. But he isn't, so how do you build the suspense of Allison's assumption with the audience, if that audience knows she's merely running through the woods without a threat chasing her? Once again, it's pointless to have this scene. And it pisses me off, because Allison being chased by Myers would have been a far better scene in this time frame of the film. They could have had Allison drive Hawkins' cruiser, with Myers in pursuit in the other cruiser, and they both still arrive at Laurie's house. Both crash near the home, Allison gets out, and the chase continues on foot. She arrives at the front door, with Myers closing in. You see? Just eliminate all of the fluffy runtime, which opens up time to implement those scenes. In some cases, you gain more runtime. Let's finish. Myers kills Karen's husband, dead weight. Myers approaches the home and reaches his quote, target. Karen is preparing to encounter Myers in the basement. I guess she has completely forgotten about her daughter. And that daughter ironically reaches the home anyway. So her running through the woods was wasted film time, which could have been a chase scene. Myers grabs Laurie's head with both hands through the glass. Physically she is lifted off her feet, and he proceeds to slam her head against the door. What the hell are we watching here? Laurie then shoots Myers' fingers off. He enters the home. They physically fight like brother and sister. All three battle Myers, knock him down into the trap, then he is set on fire. Myers did not intend on killing Laurie, because he had plenty of opportunities to do so. So in conclusion, Myers waited 40 years to escape, to finish what he started, kills tons of people in his path to his target, only to physically tussle with that target instead of just killing her. Yeah, okay. Although this is what I gathered from the entire plot of the film, there could have been a lot changed to the script, to at least make it, well, make sense overall. Allison's role was essentially useless, didn't provide any real conflict with Myers, regardless of what happened at the end. Karen was also useless, because she could have taken that same shotgun she shot Myers with, depicted as a badass, and went out to search for her daughter. The directors decided not to give much to these characters, alongside Laurie Strode, and that basically makes their roles insignificant. The directing was the biggest problem, even though I hate the idea of a retcon. For this, I give it a 2 out of 5. It could have been better, if the directors actually cared. And then there's more, Halloween Kills. This is the Chaos Sector, Film Reviews.